Dustin George, and you're listening to the Caretaker's Journey podcast.
Welcome to our meaningful conversation today. I'm your host, Carole Leatham. I have a very special guest today, Pastor Dustin George. He is a lead pastor, a writer, a conference speaker, and he has served for nearly 2 decades in various pastoral positions across all age ranges. Before entering his time in work in church ministry, Dustin taught high school English for 10 years. In his free time, Dustin can usually be found fly fishing in the Smokies. Love that. Expanding his skill as a craftsman, or enjoying his next adventure. He and his wife, Rebecca, live in the East Tennessee area, and I just want to welcome Dustin to the show.
Thanks, Carol.
So welcome,
Thank
Dustin.
you so much. So good to see you. Good to be here.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. I'm coming to Tennessee. I think by the time this airs, I'll have already been there. But one of the things that I've always wanted to do is learn to fly fish. So one of these days on one of my trips,
we can do that.
That is a dream of mine. My grandfather used to fly fish, and I used to sit on the banks and watch him. So I have these fond memories of that. So I think it would be fun to try that. And,
frustrating at first.
I think
probably.
Pardon
frustrating me? At first, usually. But once you get the hang of it, it's a glorious, wonderfully relaxing thing.
Okay, well, you and I have similar personalities, so that might be something. Well, Dustin, I have always wanted to do a podcast episode on several questions that I have gotten asked. I continue to get asked all the time. When people hear about my husband's struggles with mental health issues, they usually ask one of 3 questions. How could this happen to Bill? Why did God allow or cause this to happen to Bill? Or why? This is the one I get asked the most. Why does God allow suffering? Because they see his condition as something God has caused. And yes, the mental illness journey is full of suffering. What I love the most about you is that when I asked you to tackle this topic with me, you didn't hesitate to say yes. And then the information that you sent me was so incredible and so good and detailed that we are actually going to break this into 2 episodes. And so we have 2 episodes coming. Today, we're going to talk on thoughts on suffering and the common questions. Then next week, we're going to talk about the biblical understanding of suffering and how God uses suffering to whatever. So today, let's dive right in to the thoughts on suffering and common questions. So why don't you start us off by telling us what your initial thoughts about suffering are?
Okay. Well, it's such a wide ranging thing. When you start talking about suffering, pain, disappointment, right? Difficulty. I know you wanted to mention it later, and I know that you've been privy to a lot of the steps of it, that I've been working on a book, and it's about those dark seasons, and we'll talk more about that. But I was reminded here recently, really whenever you sent me the information and asked the question, I was thinking about a particular publisher, will remain unnamed, that sent me back some information regarding the proposal. And the information just basically said, no, we don't really think we're going to be able to take that book or anything like that, or take that idea. And then the answer, which is common, right? I mean, rejection. That's common. Don't start thinking about writing books if you are going to
you can't handle rejection.
If you say,
right?
I would like to avoid rejection, don't write books. And don't go into the ministry either. I mean, and arguably don't do much of anything, right?
I have a huge rejection button, and I do public speaking and writing and podcasting and ministry.
It's like I don't have enough rejection in my life. Let me do something else. Let me explore other avenues so I can experience it more fully. But one of the main thing that was said was this. We think that you're trying to do too much. That is, we think that you're trying to explore too many avenues of pain. And my response was more or less, I was polite, but more or less, I mean, have you ever experienced pain? Because it's not just one thing. You can't usually pin that down, because whenever you start experiencing pain, whether that's emotional, mental, physical, relational, any of those
Mm,
pains, they it tends to seep. It's like a
yeah.
water leak in a wall, or in a
Mm-hmm.
ceiling, or in a floor that you can't see initially, but then there's some dark spots that emerge, and maybe the wallpaper starts to peel, and maybe
Yeah.
there's some damp spots on the carpet, and there's something going on.
Mm-hmm.
And then you start trying to track it down, but it's not necessarily where you find the results of it, where it
Right.
starts creeping out. And so
Right.
pain tends to be very wide ranging. And one of the things that I like to say, I don't like to say it, but you understand what I mean by this. One of the things that
I
I
know what
tend
you,
to
we know
say,
what you
yeah,
mean.
is that pain is common, but it's not
Mm-hmm.
natural. And I know there's all
Yes.
sorts of little twists and semantic nuances we can play with those words. But what I mean by that is that it's common to everyone. Everyone's going to experience the pain of a broken world in some shape, form, or fashion.
Right.
It's not natural in the sense of it is not the intended design for us.
Mm,
And because it's not the
yes.
intended design, that is one of the reasons it hurts so much. And that is one of the reasons that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, we all experience that, and we all scratch our heads over it, because we're saying this is not supposed to be this way. And that's just true. I mean, and even though
Mm-hmm.
as a sovereign God has taken into account human error, and God has taken into account sin, and that
Right.
is all part of a much larger plan that we can't get our heads around.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea that we are made for relationship with God, unbroken relationship with God, and sin has disrupted that. But not just disrupted that, it's disrupted the
Mm-hmm.
way that we relate to reality on a day by day basis. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's a wide ranging thing. I get asked this as a pastor a lot. Nearly 20 years now. Next year will be 20 years in full
Mm-hmm.
time church ministry. And the number of times I've been asked by people, why? Why pain? Why suffering?
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of the reasons that I was probably so quick to answer you with with that massive
Yeah.
information, is because I've I've thought about it a lot. Not only other people's pain, trying to help them, but just walking through difficult times myself, trying to turn
Yeah.
them over and make sense of 'em.
Absolutely. One of the hardest things for me when my book first came out was promoting it. When you go to
Mhm.
promote it, and somebody picked it up and said, "Oh, I want, this is a great book. Let me read it." And then I have some great connections, some big connections that I want to put it through to. And what I've discovered is these big connections won't touch the
Ah,
topic. They don't want to touch the topic. In fact, one of them came back and said, this is too raw, this is too transparent, it's too
mm,
personal, and I'm not sure people can relate to it.
wow.
And I started laughing because it's
Right.
that perpetuates what I was already feeling. I'm
Sure.
alone. I'm unique. God has a problem with me. This is, it kind of perpetuates that
Sure.
idea that my suffering is unique to me. Now there are parts of it
Certainly.
that are,
Yes.
but the overarching thing that I have discovered is that we're not talking about something that is an
Mm,
epidemic in our
mhm,
world, and that is mental
mhm.
illness and how it affects our
Certainly.
lives and how it creates suffering and how it frames our view of
Mm,
God based on what we understand or want to understand or what we don't actually understand
certainly.
about God.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm so glad we're doing this. Um, you have a statement that you sent me that I want you to unpack. It says, people have long wrestled with both the existence of God and the character of God in light of the reality of
Mhm.
suffering. So good. So good. So give us some additional thoughts on
Well,
that
if
statement.
you back up, um, and sort of and look at it, you'll find, you know, when people start talking about it, people start talking about suffering today. Um,
Mm-hmm.
we can sometimes live with this, I don't know, historical amnesia, where we act like
I
we're
love
the first ones.
so true.
So we're the first ones to experience this we're the first ones. We've reached this point in our thought process that we are questioning God. Oh, this is
Mm,
a question, a really old question. And you find that there's some ways that people tend to address this. Um,
mhm.
one of the things I sent you was a quote from a Greek philosopher Epicurus, and this is back
Yes.
uh, lived 341 270 BC, and this is what he said about the lowercase plural gods of Greece in their time. He said the gods can either take away evil from the world and will not, or being willing to do so cannot, or they neither can
Mm,
nor will, or lastly, they are able and willing. If they have the will to remove evil, so they want to remove it, and cannot,
right.
they're not omnipotent. If they
Mm,
can, but will not, then they are not benevolent. So if they can remove the evil, but they decide we're not
wow.
going to remove the evil, they're not good. If they are neither able nor willing, so they can't and they neither want to, they are neither
Right.
omnipotent nor benevolent. Lastly, if they are both able and willing to annihilate evil, why does it exist? And so this is not a Christian. This is not a Christian. This is not
Right.
someone with Jewish thinking. This is someone who is wrestling with evil in a pagan culture and is coming to the
Mhm.
conclusion that either you know these if we would say it's the same questions that we would ask and the same kind of uh, logical kind of uh, questioning that we would put out there and posit. So if the idea is, and I've heard people say all of these. Okay, well, evil exists, suffering exists, pain exists, so therefore God must not exist. Okay,
Right. Right.
or God exists, but he's not good because he doesn't do something about the suffering. God
Mhm.
exists and he is good, but in some way he just lacks the power to do anything about it. He just can't. As Epicurus would have said about the pagan gods, they're not omnipotent. And then God exists and he's good, and the modern argument is he lacks the knowledge of the future events. So therefore, you know, so he's just as surprised as we are by this. And it's as though God is saying, well, I would have done something had I seen it coming, but I am just as shocked and
Oh, jeez.
I didn't see that coming either. And that's that whole open theism idea where
Yeah.
and then I think you could take it. One of the things I didn't mention in some of the notes I sent you, but I think you could take it to the other extreme too and say, well, God does want to do something about suffering. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have some of the prosperity gospel type stuff
Right.
that says, well,
Right.
God's going to do something about
Absolutely.
it right now. And if you have enough faith or you speak the right words, then you will not suffer. You won't get sick. There won't be any problems. There won't be anything. And God will remove all suffering in the here and now. Like we're going to get a full restoration, not
Mm.
then, but now. A funny story. A couple of years ago, I had a guy. Uh, he he was wrestling with theology, and he came to me and he said, "Pastor, I just want you to know, I think I've come to the conclusion that God wants us to be completely healed of everything right here, right now." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm really believing that." And I said, "So you mean avoid all pain and suffering?" He said, "Yeah, all pain, all suffering." And I said, "Well, you know, Paul um, was an incredible man of faith." "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah." I said, "He was beaten and he was shipwrecked." I mean, he has that whole laundry list of all sorts of things that he went
Right.
through.
Yeah.
And he said, "Yeah, but I just think it's different now." And he just kept on and he kept on and he kept telling me how he believes that's one reason that he's so healthy, and he just believes this is because of his faith. And I just let him finish. And then I said, mean, why do you still wear glasses? And he's like, what are you
Yes.
talking about? And I said, can you see without your glasses? And he said, well, no. And I said, well, do you believe that Jesus wants to heal us completely of every disorder, every disease, every physical ailment and shortcoming? He said, well, yeah. And I said, well, I mean, I think you should probably take off your glasses then and just trust that he's going to restore your sight, 20/20 vision. And he said, hadn't really thought of that. I said, well,
Yeah.
I mean, if you're going to be consistent, let's be logically consistent all the way through, right?
I think I've kind of come to the conclusion that we treat this idea like a candy store where we walk in and maybe we want this today or we want that today, and we apply that to God. And things like the prosperity gospel, which tells us that, God wants to bless you, and they take Jeremiah 29:11 out
Yes.
of context and say, I know the plans for you, whatever. We could have a whole show on that one. What I think I have seen over the last 10 years that just appalls me, makes me sad and frustrates me, and then makes me constantly question, is I've had so many people come up to me and say, oh, your husband doesn't have enough faith, and I tell a story in the book about a few weeks after he came home from the hospital. We were still struggling with the suicidal ideation, and I was literally on 24-hour watch with him. I didn't feel comfortable closing my eyes, even walking out of a room, because he did not want to live. And we went to a church service, a large church service, and the pastor was preaching, and it didn't have anything to do with this topic of mental health or medication, whatever. In the middle of his sermon, he stops and he looks out into this thousands of people in this audience. It was a huge church. And he says, I just have to stop and say something right now. If you're on medication for depression right now, you need to get on your knees and get off that medication, because God is all you need. And I caught my breath, because I am sitting next to a man of faith who has what I believe is considered a brain disorder. And it's not an issue of faith. This is a man who prays and reads. He has a list of probably 35 people he prays for every single day. He reads every morning his scripture and whatever. He is constantly crying out to God. And I thought, how ignorant.
Yeah.
That how dangerous. And guess what? The pastor wore glasses.
There you go. Right.
I don't tell that part in the book.
It's true, right?
But it is true. It is so true. So let's talk for a second. What are these old origins of the question of why God would allow suffering? Because you and I both know this has been around. Like you talked about
Epicurus,
the E guy. I can't say his name. But what are the old origins of this question? Because I don't know that it's ever going to go away, but I'm kind of curious to know where it kind of originated from.
Well, I mean, you can go all the way back. You go all the way back to Job, let's say.
Yes.
And historians say that if you go all the way back, they believe that Job was one of the earliest penned books of the Bible. And I know people say, "No, wait a minute, what about Genesis?"
I know.
I'm not.
We're gonna get letters,
right.
Dustin. We're gonna get letters
chronologically. The order of the storyline. I'm not talking about Job pre-existed before the world. I am saying, though, that it is believed, with the information, that Job was penned before Moses penned the Pentateuch.
Yes,
and
I've
so
heard that.
And so you look at, say, you look at Job, and you look at his suffering, and the thing is, we're privy. I was an English major and then an English teacher for 10 years. So, there's that thing called dramatic irony, where the audience knows something that one of the characters does not know. So, it's like modern day, you're looking at you're watching a movie and don't go in that closet, because The
Right.
killer is in the
Right. You're
closet,
screaming at the
right?
screen. Wait,
Don't
don't
do
open that
that,
door.
right? So we know something a main character doesn't know. So we are
Right.
given the information beforehand. We're given behind
Mm-hmm.
the spiritual curtain as to the discussion going on between God and Satan wanting
Yes.
to disrupt Job's life and destroy him and all sorts of other stuff. And then you have Job. He has no idea. And so,
He
no,
doesn't
he
know.
doesn't know. And then you have chapter after chapter of
Yeah.
Job trying to figure this out. And then his friends come, his comforters, we'll
Yeah.
put that in air quotes, his comforters come. And they're like,
Yeah.
well,
Quotes.
clearly,
Air quotes.
Job, you must
Comforters.
have done
Mhm.
something wrong. Because, I mean, why would God do
Yes.
this if, you didn't do something? Clearly, there's something. And Job is, in his suffering, is now having to defend his own life before them, not his
Mm.
physical life, but he's having to defend his integrity before them, saying, guys, I really, there's nothing that I can, there's nothing I can come up with. I'm coming up empty on all of this. And so even he struggles with that. And then you have God showing up at the end, right? And then God
Yes.
shows up, and then God says, okay, Job, who are you to question me? Let me ask you some questions. You've been asking me some questions. Let me ask you some questions. Where were you? Where were you when I created
Yes.
everything? Which is another
Yes.
evidence that Job is not pre-exist. Okay, right? So
Right.
where were you, Job,
Right.
when I created everything? Do you know where the storehouses of snow are kept? Do you know this? Do you know that? Do you know all this about the
Mm-hmm.
natural world? Can you explain that to me? And Job's like, sorry, still got to turn, God. I
Yeah.
got a little ahead of myself. And then God says, no, there's more. And he just keeps, and he keeps
Yeah.
piling it on.
He keeps
And then
going.
basically he says, I'm God, and you're
Yeah.
not. And then Job
Mm-hmm.
responds with, I've spoken. I'm going to butcher the quote, but it's like, I've spoken things that are too great for me. He said, I'm going to put my hand over my mouth, like I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
shut my mouth before you, oh
Yeah.
God. And I had, when I was going back to English major, I was in World Lit whenever I was in college, and I remember the professor. And we were reading through a big, massive tome of a thing that we read through for World Lit 1 and World Lit 2, massive book that went through the ancient world and all sorts of other things, World Lit 1. And I remember the book of Job was in there. And we read
Okay.
it. This was not a Christian college or a religious college of any shape, form, or fashion. But we read it as though it was literature, right? Because it was one of the oldest,
Okay.
it was like the oldest Hebrew literature there. And so as we're reading through that, I'll never forget the professor. And I became a Christian when I was around 6.5 years old. So I'm sitting here in this college classroom, and the professor, we get to the end of the book of Job. She says, God had the perfect opportunity to explain suffering so that we would all understand it. And he dodged answering Job. He gave him
Wow.
this answer that tried to circumvent taking responsibility and explaining it to us. And the class nodded. And of course, me,
Wow.
with my inability often to leave things as they are.
I love that. I love that about
Well,
you.
it's good or bad, right? But I raised my hand and she said, yes, Mr. George. And I said, well, this presupposes that God owes us an explanation. And she said, excuse me? And I said, God doesn't owe us an explanation. God didn't owe Job an explanation. God doesn't owe me an explanation. It must be enough to say God is God and we are not. Because if we could understand it all, then he wouldn't really be a God that inspires awe and that there's mystery involved with him. And I said, so you know what? I'm okay with that. He doesn't owe me an explanation. And she didn't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
But I don't think a lot of us do, because I think so many people come away, even in suffering, they read the book of Job, say, this
Mm-hmm.
earliest account, they read this book of Job and they come away and they say, that wasn't helpful. Now I'm even more disturbed. Like, Satan,
Yeah.
Satan is talking to God, and God says, "Go ahead, have at him." Go ahead, and then God is the one who brings Job up, right? Have you considered
Yes.
my servant Job? There's no one like him. He avoids evil.
Mm-hmm.
He's my guy. Satan's like, okay, well, let me at him. God's like, okay, you know.
I think that there are two truths that you've kind of brought to the forefront, and that is that we as human beings, because God gave us free will, we abuse that free will and then go back to God and expect him to live within our own concept
Sure.
of him. We sort of paint this picture of God and hang it on the wall. And when we look at it, we go, well, you should do this. You should do this. And we start telling God who he is instead of sitting with God and reading the scriptures and understanding. And if you go all the way back to Genesis, this is where I always go when I start contemplating these hard questions. You go all the way back to the creation of the world. And we see how God created the whole world, and then he created it so that man could have dominion. But there was one rule, and he said, you can do anything you want in the garden except for this. And what did we do? Because I'm not saying I wouldn't have been in the same position had I been in the garden instead of Adam. I have to accept that is who I would be as well, because I have the same choices. But Adam makes this decision with Eve, and they
disobey God.
do one thing, and then God kicks them out. And I had someone say to me one time, see, God, we had this perfect life, and then God kicked us out. Because I think we want to sidestep our responsibility. We always want to sidestep our responsibility. And when people approach me, and I had a man in February of last year, I was at a big event, and he came over, stomped up to the table, picked up my book, said, is this your book? I said, yes. He goes, I saw this book. Your husband was a pastor. And obviously he had done some, recon on me. But he said to me, what is his sin?
Oh, wow.
And I said, excuse me, what do you mean? And he goes, what is his sin? You don't have this type of mental instability without there being an unconfessed sin.
Wow, that sounds familiar.
And I go,
hey, Job.
Yeah. And I said, yeah.
What did you do
And I said,
wrong?
there is no sin. Yeah. I looked at him and I said, I wanted to say something not so nice, but I looked at him and I said, I don't understand why you feel like this is an unconfessed sin. And so he said, well, there's something. And I said, well, if there's any sin here, it's the sin of my husband's control and his anxiety, because he somehow has this started in childhood need for control, which creates an anxiety that doesn't let his mind rest. And then that anxiety creates a depression because you never get a break. And then that depression starts to, and I looked at the man and his eyes are kind of going back, and he goes, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I want to know what and I'm like on the inside, I just turned around and walked away from him, because I was like, what, how could he, number one, just barge into my space without even knowing the circumstances?
Makes you wonder what kind of sin that guy had to lead to that sort of pride, right? Like,
we all,
you know what I'm saying, though?
I think
it's like, why are you the way that you are, sir? Well, I wonder what sin has led you to think it's okay to do this. I mean,
yeah, but we want to try to deflect.
Certainly.
We do want to try to deflect. So there's a great book by Harold Kushner, and you talk about this when you talked about this in your notes when you sent them to me, when bad things happen to good people. I love this book. And I want you to share with us what Harold says about adopting the lack of power argument to absolve God for the pain in the world.
Problem with when bad things happen to good people is that there are no good people. That's the that's the issue. And Harold Kushner tries to create a God that is not a biblical God. He says, if God is a God of justice and not of power, then he can still be on our side when bad things happen to us. So he's saying, God is a good God, he's a just God, but he doesn't have all the power, is what Harold Kushner is arguing. Very much like what Epicurus said. He can know that we are good and honest people who deserve better. Okay, full stop for a second. When Jesus says there is none good, no, not one, and Harold Kushner saying, God knows that we're good and we deserve better. I don't want what I deserve biblically.
Right.
Biblically, I
Yeah.
deserve an eternal separation from God in hell because of my sin, right? Our misfortunes are none of his doing, and so we can turn to him for help. Our question will not be Job's question, God, why are you doing this to me? But rather, God, see what is happening to me. Can you help me? We turn to God not to be judged or
Mm,
forgiven, not to be rewarded or punished, but to be strengthened and comforted. So Kushner tries to make the argument that God is not a God of power. He looks at those back and forth, and Kushner comes down on, well, and he came to this conclusion after a very personal, deep loss. And he comes to
right.
the conclusion, well, God wants to do something about this. He really cares. He just can't do anything about it. He's powerless in the face of that.
It goes back to the four things we were talking
It
about a
goes
few
back to
minutes
that.
ago. We always
And
land.
if you look at any, I was thinking about this morning, actually driving to work. If you start looking at any heresy, um, and you find all these different streams, and this one's a little bit, so many degrees off of biblical truth. This one's way off. Eventually, they all flow into the same river that runs
Yes.
away from the biblical idea of God. It will either
Mm-hmm.
flow away from God's character, his goodness, his holiness, his omnipotence, his sovereignty. It all goes in a different direction. And here's the other thing. I think it was A.W. Tozer. I may be wrong, but I think A.W. Tozer said one time something to the effect of, I have all these weasel words I'm putting in case I get this wrong. Somebody may correct me on this. It's something to the effect of, all of God does all God does. So the idea is
Ooh.
that God is unified in his character. And so when God works, it's not that God is acting in conflict with some other aspect of his character. It's not when someone sins and dies without Christ and they're separated from God. It's not that God wrings his hands and says, I really wish I could have done something about that, but I'm really having to hold to this
Yeah.
other area, and I'm really at conflict with myself about that. That doesn't happen. Everything that God
Right.
does, he does it with a fullness of character. And so
Mm-hmm.
whenever you start taking any idea of suffering or any other aberrant type of understanding of anything, and you start twisting one little thing to say, well, I'm going to twist this one little thing, and maybe it doesn't mean what it seems to mean. I'm going to twist that to make it more comfortable for myself. By default, you change the setting all across the board. Everything else is connected. So if you say, I'm going to dial down God's sovereignty on this, well, there are some other things that get dialed down and some other things that get changed because they're all interconnected and you can't separate them out.
Yeah. I think as we kind of start winding down this first episode, you wrote a statement that really resonated with me. You said, there's a question, why is there suffering? And then you immediately said this question must be replaced with the more pressing and revealing question, which is, why should we have a problem with human suffering? And that made me kind of sit back and think. I actually sat for quite a few minutes thinking about that, because how easy is it for us, especially with social media and TV, we know when suffering happens, like immediately. If there's suffering going on, all we have to do is pull it up on social media, pull it up on the internet, turn on the TV. And it's real easy for us to turn it off. It's easy for us to shut it down. And I remember a few years ago, I was ministering to a pastor's wife in Africa. And it was during some of the really bad wars that were coming on. And she sent me some photographs, real life time, like she took them from her phone and texted them to me. And I did not know what to do with the emotions of what I was seeing. And I think, and we're going to talk about this in the next episode a little bit of how the biblical understanding is, but let's just talk for a second about what C.S. Lewis, let's close with this, what C.S. Lewis says and how he confronted this mistaken kind of concept or
Sure.
notion.
And the question that when I voiced that or sent you that, why is there suffering? Well, then what's the problem with suffering? Because that
Right.
really, I've had people say there cannot be a God because there's suffering in the world. And then I always ask them,
Yeah.
I'm like, well, what do you believe in? And they say, well, I believe in evolutionary theory. And I said, so you believe that we are a product of randomness and we are survival of the fittest? And the person said,
Mm-hmm.
he looked at me and he said, absolutely. And I said, what's your problem with suffering?
Wow.
And he said, what do you mean? Suffering's
Yeah.
bad. And I said, wait a minute. Are you talking about weak people? Weak people who are suffering, who are being taken advantage of? He goes, yeah. And I said, they're weak. According to your viewpoint.
Wow.
I said, so according to your
Yeah.
viewpoint, this is just survival of the fittest. I said, listen, bigger, faster, stronger wins, according to your viewpoint. So if bigger, faster, stronger wins, and the bigger, faster, stronger starts winning, and we see that, and that means that
Right.
that the smaller and the slower and the weaker are suffering. What's your problem with that? This is your belief system in
Right.
practice. Well, he didn't like that. He said,
Mm-hmm.
because
Yeah.
because there's that inconsistency. He's like, no, suffering is bad. And the question is, if suffering is bad, then that means we must have an ultimate standard of what good is.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
we say that ultimate
Absolutely.
standard, we understand it to be God. And so
Yes.
if we say suffering's bad, wrong, or unfair, that means there is a standard of perfect
Mm-hmm.
and of rightness and of fairness, of righteousness. And so this is what C.S. Lewis gets at. This is what he wrote. He wrote, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply it did not happen to please my private fancies. So without God, our morality, our judgment,
So good.
all of that, it's nothing but culturally determined. It's nothing more than personal preferences. It doesn't have any sort of universal standing. It doesn't have any universal meaning. It's just my tiny little half acre of a worldview and the way that it doesn't work here right now. And I can't take that and extrapolate that and then put that as a template on everybody else. Unless there is a universal idea of good, right, and just that
Right.
exists above us in a transcendent way. That's God.
Wow. Well, Dustin, I know your first book is coming out in November, and I have had the pleasure of getting to preview it, and I am very excited about it. So tell us just a little short synopsis of the book and then how people can stay connected to you.
The book comes out November 12th of this year, 2024. It is called Before Dawn, Knowing God's Presence in the Dark Seasons of Life. And it covers a lot of the ground that we covered today and more. And I explore waiting on God, disappointment, worry, anxiety, fear. If it's as the publisher said, I think you're trying to do too much. No, I don't think so. But it is a wide ranging kind of roving exploration into just some of the hardest topics of life that we experience. So that'll be coming out.
I love that.
They can your listeners can read. They can read some excerpts because some of it came from my blog. They're not listed as excerpts, but they originated there. But DustinCGeorge.com. That will soon change, but that's okay. We'll have a link on that blog to the new blog. And then I'm on Instagram, Dustin C. George. I post not a lot of stuff about the book, more stuff about our dog. That's but
Jasper.
Jasper.
I love
Yeah.
Jasper. Well, I will put all of this information in the show notes so that you can find Dustin. And as I say often on my shows when I'm talking with somebody, if you need to follow Dustin on social media. He's a fantastic photographer and does a lot of hiking, and some of the photographs that he posts on social media are just really incredible. I take a lot of mini vacations sitting and looking at your photographs. Well, I like to ask my guests every show the same question as I close out, because while you're not a caretaker, Dustin, I know that in the past you have, because of some family stuff that has happened. But I always like to ask everybody to think about this question, because I make it a practice every day to stop and think, okay, what one thing am I going to do today to take care of me? Because if I can't take care of me as a caretaker to my husband, my mother, and another family member, I'm not going to be able to take care of them effectively. So, Dustin, what are you going to do in the next 24 hours to take care of you? And I just want to let you know that last week's show, I asked this to a gal in rural Iowa, and she said, well, I'm going to go out and chop wood. And I was like, I've never had that answer before. And she sent me a photo last night of her actually chopping wood. I loved it. So now I'm kind of upping the ante for you because I know you have a lot of fun things, but what are you going to do in the next 24 hours to take care of you, Dustin? If you speak it, you have to do it. Sorry, Rebecca.
Okay. Well, I'll give you two that I plan. I do plan on doing these. And I may be doing them at the same time in the next 24 hours. I don't know. One is, we have a back deck here at our home that looks out at this wooded area. And one of the things I like to do, because I'm usually at my desk, I'm at meetings, whether they're meetings at church or whether they are on campus, and it never seems to end. And that's just part of the nature of it. But one thing, I plan on doing this tonight, actually. I plan on, Rebecca has a dinner with one of her cousins tonight. So I'm going to be here. And my plan is I'm going to go out and I'm going to get one of our deck chairs and I'm just going to sit, and I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to read. I'm not going to look at my phone. I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to sit. I'm just going to sit and listen to the cicada scream. Right. That's what I'm going to do. Because they're screaming here in the evenings. But anyway, I'm just going to sit, and I'm going to, and for me, having a time where I don't have to be engaged with something.
Yeah.
I don't have to be answering an email or answering a text or a phone call or planning something, right? Because I plan out sermons, weeks in advance usually, and then I work on them the week before and finalize a lot of stuff. So that's one thing I'm going to do. The second thing, I have some leather projects. I know that you've seen some of those. You actually have one of those.
I own one. It's one of my most cherished possessions.
Own one, right? You do own that satchel that I made you. But
yes,
one of the things I'm going to do is I have found that it requires so much. Like I can't. Let me put it this way: I can't do one of those leather projects mindlessly, because there's so many details. Because I hand stitch everything. There's so many things that I have to focus upon, that I can get so focused on that I don't think about anything else except just that thing that I'm producing, and creating. And so that's another thing that I'm going to do in the next 24 hours. I've got a project I'm working on that I'll hopefully will be able to at least make some headway on.
I love it.
So those two things for me, that's super relaxing.
Well, thank you for joining me today and for helping me dive in. We're going to do part 2 next week of this conversation on suffering, and I'll put all the links to your website and information in the show notes. I also want to tell each of you listeners that I appreciate you so much. Our journey as caregivers can be so hard, and we can get caught up in so many different emotions: fear, exhaustion, anger, impatience. And this week I felt all of those. We can also have a tendency to isolate and feel like we're alone. And I really feel like sometimes we just sort of delve into this question of, why is God letting me suffer? But I want you to know that this ministry, the Carol's Journey podcast, our Carol's Journey ministry, exists to let you know that you are not alone, that you are loved and seen by Almighty God, and that He cares, and that He shows up in your life. And there are over 55 million of us in the US. And yes, I'm one, you're one. That means we're not alone. We're not alone. And if you would like to know more about my personal caretaking journey, the links to my website, my social media, and my book, Are You Ready to Find Joy When Life Gets Messy?, will be in the show notes. And I will be back next week for another meaningful conversation with Dustin on suffering. We're going to unpack the biblical idea of suffering. And until then, it's all about Him.